Hey there, my little AP huggers. This is Sanchez back with another thrilling lecture. Just by the title alone, take a look right there, Theories of Economic Development. And in this supplemental lecture, we're going to talk about or try to address the question, what factors explain the differences in levels of economic development? We've talked about the MDC versus LDC. We've looked at how we measure that with our HDI index. So this lecture is going to be talking about our different models and theories. The first one we want to talk about is something called the modernization model. According to this theory, also called the westernization model, Britain was the first country to begin to develop its industry. Several reasons why Britain industrializes first. Number one, of course, natural resources. It has access to coal. It has access to water. It has a very high population from the agricultural revolution, workers in those factories. We also have economic resources, a banking industry, political stability, innovation. So there's several reasons why Britain really sets the stage. Now, once Britain started, the British model spread to other European nations and, of course, to the United States, which prospered and benefited because they were built on this British ingenuity and economic practice. They stole a lot of these ideas and put them into practice. By extension, any country that wants an economy to grow should study the paths taken by industrialized nations. So if they want to grow, obviously they need to look to a good role model. They need to see what those countries are doing and kind of try to replicate or duplicate that process. And they logically too can benefit and get help from this modernization, or I guess we could refer to it in quotes, the westernization. Modernization theory identifies tradition as the greatest barrier from economic development. Countries need to be open to change, ideas, and to kind of replicate the process or the steps it takes to develop that economic success. In societies with strong family systems and ties that are kind of holding on to the past, and cultures discourage people from adopting these new technologies, that's going to hurt them when they're trying to raise their standard of living. So that would be one way to briefly introduce the modernization model. On the flip side, we also have the dependency theory. And in this case, this puts the primary responsibility for global poverty on rich nations. In contrast, kind of the difference than what we see in the modernization model, dependency theory holds that economic development of many countries in the world is blocked. It's actually held back by the fact that industrialized nations exploit them. They take advantage of them. They take their natural resources. They take their smartest, their best worker supply. So there's lots of ways in which they exploit them. And how can a country possibly develop when its resources are controlled by just a few handful of the prosperous industrialized nations? We're referring to those core countries that control and lead the way as far as economic and cultural direction. So this inequality has roots in the colonial imperialism era, when European nations colonialized and exploited the resources of other countries around the world. So really, with dependency theory, problems then cannot be just solved just by copying the Western model or the modernization model, but they need to be addressed by establishing independence. All right, let's first look a little farther into this whole idea of the modernization theory. And in the case, in your textbook, it also has ties to the discussion of the development through international trade, Rostow's development model. And the modernization theory holds and thinks that economic prosperity is open to all countries. And according to Rostow, there's different stages of development. All right, in Rostow's model, the first stage would be something called the traditional stage. People in traditional societies build their lives around family, local communities, and religious beliefs. Their lives are very similar to those of those ancestors, the people in the past generations, and they generally have very limited wealth and money. Most people in this particular stage are subsistence farmers. And a century ago, most of the countries of the world were in the initial stage of economic development, and some still are. All right, stage 2 in the model is known as the preconditions for takeoff. Usually an elite group gets to go and initiates the innovation for economic activity, excuse me. Under the influence of those well-educated leaders, the country starts to actually invest and put time and money and thought into this new technology and the infrastructure that they're going to need for development. These can include water supplies and for transportation, communication. These projects will ultimately stimulate the increase for productivity. All right, our next stage will be the takeoff. And so often with encouragement of the leaders, when people start experimenting and looking into producing goods, not just for consumption, but also for trade with others for profit, the country experiences something like an industrial revolution and sustained growth takes hold. Urbanization, which again we're talking about the growth of cities, and technological and production breakthroughs occur. Greater individualism and the willingness to actually take risk and actually start business and actually put yourself out there, and the desire for material goods also take hold, often at the expense of family ties and traditional customs. Now, stage 4 is called the drive to maturity. During this stage, economic growth is widely accepted and people focus on attaining their higher living standards. The economy diversifies as people become more prosperous and can afford some luxuries. Many miss the security of family and local community life, but poverty has been reduced greatly, and some of the material goods are much more common. Cities grow as far as more people live the farms, and they're going away from that traditional society, and modernization is more apparent in the core areas of the country. The rate of population growth is reduced as children require more years of schooling and education in order to survive in an increasingly complex society and become more expensive to raise. International trade expands in this particular stage. Our last stage will be the age of mass consumption or high mass consumption. Economic development steadily raises the living standards as mass production encourages consumption of industrial products. Items that have been seen as luxuries in previous stages now become necessities as the society is structured on the expanding array of goods produced. In this stage is marked by high incomes and a majority of the workers involved in the service sector of the economy. Now, following this development model, the modernization theory claims that high-income countries can actually help the poor countries by encouraging them and helping them control population growth, helping them increase their food production, and of course take advantage of the industrial technology. They may also provide poorer countries with foreign aid. Now, people that would criticize this particular model obviously can observe that we don't see modernization simply has not occurred in many of our poorer LDC countries. Another thing to consider, of course, a criticism is that the modernization theory fails to recognize that rich nations, these MDCs, actually benefit from leaving the way it is. In some cases, they actually block paths to development in poor countries. Because remember, these MDCs are exploiting and taking advantage as a core country of these countries that are LDCs or in that periphery regions. Something else to think about is that poor countries today actually develop from a position of global weakness. It's much more difficult to go through this process than it was in the 19th century, a lot more obstacles. So the modernization theory doesn't take for granted that development or industrialization back in the 19th century is very much different than how a country is going to try to navigate that through the current century and the different roadblocks that it might entail. When you think about it as well, a lot of critics would say modernization theory almost kind of blames the victim. It puts the case of poverty lies within the poor societies themselves and telling them it's kind of their responsibility to step up, kind of make it happen, kind of push themselves through these different development levels. All right, another one of the theories I want to briefly talk about is the dependency theory. And Wallerstein first explained this economic development using 3 categories, which we mentioned in a previous lecture, which is going to be core, semi-periphery, and periphery. And as a dependency theorist, Wallerstein traced economic inequality among nations back to the colonial era or imperialism time period when Europeans first took advantage of the wealth of the rest of the world. He divided into those three categories, which we have the core, which are the rich nations that fuel the economy. We have core countries in the semi-periphery, which are the remaining countries kind of somewhere in between. And then on the outskirts, we have the periphery, which are the low-income countries drawn into the world economy by colonial exploitation and continue today to even support the rich ones by providing inexpensive labor, natural resources, and large markets for industrial products. So in contrast to the modernization theory that puts kind of most of the responsibility for development in individual countries, dependency theory emphasizes the idea that no country develops in isolation because the global economy shapes the destiny of all nations. Of course, one of the major criticisms for dependency theory would be the fact that some people believe too much blame is placed on these rich core countries that have a long history of supporting economies of nations. And these dependency theorists are also criticized for ignoring the cultural factors in poor countries that discourage economic growth, such as that values placed and emphasize family, tradition, rather than focusing on the innovation, technology, business part of it. The last piece that I want to briefly introduce that they talk about in your reading from Key Issue 4 is something called the self-sufficiency. So if we looked at the modernization model and Rostow's development, encourages LDCs to try to identify and develop products so they can actually trade and be involved in international markets. The self-sufficiency model actually encouraged them to pull back and isolate their fledgling businesses from the competitions of large international corporations, kind of focus on themselves, just looking inside development. According to this model, the self-sufficiency advocates, the LDCs, can only escape this global inequality by protecting young businesses, local businesses from trade, international markets, and encouraging actually the growth from inside the country. Countries can actually help self-sufficiency by settling barriers, actually putting ways to protect the limit of import of goods from other places. So the whole idea, folks, is to make sure that you're encouraging your businesses within your borders to develop, so you don't want other countries bringing their goods in a cheaper price that countries will buy. So we see there's lots of things placed on that as far as import, tax, and different barriers to try to restrict that competition as you're developing your business. In your textbook, for example, India used all of the methods for years to try to encourage internal economic development. Although many Indian companies grew under the self-sufficiency model, one problem emerged was inefficiency. With the government subsidies, basically the government giving cash to these businesses and try to protect them, businesses didn't really have any incentive. They didn't have any real reason to improve quality or lower production costs or reduce prices, or sometimes their products were just simply worse than, inferior to, but still more expensive than what we saw in the international market. Now again, in Key Issue number 4, we just gave you the example. India was given as a case study of self-sufficiency. I also want you to take a close look at the example for international trade, which are the Asian tigers, Hong Kong, South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, whose economies boomed starting in the 1960s, who use export-oriented industrialization, basically meaning that they focused on concentrate production to try to find a place in international markets. They try to find something unique or something they specialized in that would provide them an advantage in the global market. So pay close attention to that section, development through trade, the examples of the 4 Asian dragons as far as international trade approach. All right, folks, I know that's a lot to take in, but make sure you supplement this lecture with your reading, which is in Key Issue 4, and I'll see you guys in class.